Bonsoir et bienvenue à tous.
Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the BIBLIOTOPIA Festival, the abridged version. This is the first event of the festival, and I'm very pleased to have with me Pascale Kramer and Elisa Shua Dusapin. Good evening. Welcome. In 2018, we talked about borders and the social role of the author in 2019. This year, BIBLIOTOPIA is devoted to the family. And that's why I think it is so great that you can be with us this evening, because this topic is very present in our lives and in literature, and it's one of the subjects that you explore in your books, each one of you with her own specific way of dealing with the subject. And we're going to spend the next hour talking about this. Let me begin by introducing you. Pascale Kramer, you're a French and Swiss author. You were born in Geneva. You have been living in Paris for quite some time, I believe. You have published about 15 books, just to name a few: The Living, The Merciless Brutality of Awakening, A Shaken Man, Gloria, Autopsy of a Father, and your latest book, A Family, published in 2018, which has a very subtle construction and brings together the points of view of different family members around their oldest son, Romain, who suffers from a disease that we'll talk about later. In 2017, you received the Swiss Grand Prize for Literature for the entire body of your work, and this is something which you share with Elisa Shua Dusapin, because in 2017 you received the Swiss Prize for Literature, not the Grand Prize, but the Swiss Prize. That was your first book, which was published in 2016, Winter in Sokcho. This propelled you into the center of the Swiss literary world for French-speaking literature, and in fact, the world over, because the book was translated into several other languages. Then you went off to New York and exiled yourself to work on your second book, Les Billes du Pachinko, which was published in 2019, and most recently, you have published Vladivostok Circus, which takes us to the edge of Eastern Russia. So let me start by delving into your text and taking two characters from your books, Mathilde from your book, Pascale, and Claire from Les Billes du Pachinko, your book, Elisa. For these two young women, the family is a place where one is bored. It's a place of boredom. I wouldn't say that family itself is a place of boredom for Claire. In fact, I don't even know if boredom is the right word. In Les Billes du Pachinko, Claire may seem that if she's bored, it's a suffocatingly hot summer in Tokyo. She has come to Tokyo because she wants to take her grandparents to their native South Korea for one trip, because they have been exiled in Japan for over 50 years. And she comes up against a great deal of resistance from their side. She even wonders if they want to make this trip, or if she's the one who wants to make the trip. And there's also a confrontation of languages. They criticize her for having forgotten Korean, her mother tongue. She was born and raised in Switzerland, and learning Japanese to communicate with them because they live in Japan. So here she is in Japan in a very static situation, and she gives French lessons to a little Japanese girl whose mother is a professor of French at the university and is hoping to send her daughter to Switzerland to finish her studies. So Claire is in the midst of all this, and she feels torn by her family's wishes and expectations. There's an embryonic conflict with her grandparents at foot. And then there's the geopolitical conflict between Korea and Japan and the weight of the history of those two countries together. But perhaps more important than any of the rest are the confrontations and the contradictions she has inside her. She's almost 30. She's about to turn 30, and she's wondering whether she'll ever become a mother. She looks at this little girl who she's teaching and sees that her mother is having trouble raising her in Japanese society. Difficult for a university professor and an independent woman to be raising a child, and she wonders about herself in that context.
For Mathilde, I don't know whether the family is a place of boredom, but as you have mentioned, Romain, the eldest boy of the family, born of a first marriage of the mother, suffers from a disease. He's alcoholic, terribly alcoholic, and we will see throughout the novel how each member of the family experiences this illness. The smallest, the youngest daughter, has only ever known her brother as someone who is ill. Everything centers on her older brother. She has been somewhat neglected by the family, but she also wanted to be close. She revolted also to a certain extent. She didn't want to be like the rest of the family. She's the one who's going to try and free herself from the family. The family is a bourgeois family, a Catholic family of believers, so she's going to rebel against this to a certain extent. But she does this in a mimetic way to imitate what her brother does. Well, if it isn't boredom that one encounters in families, I nevertheless have the impression there is a tension which comes from the experience of these two young women who are full of energy, but who meet up against the lethargical aspect of families. And isn't that what you try to work on? Yes, we're talking about young women, not quite adolescents, but a young woman in one case, young women who are of a generation where women express themselves. And I think this does constitute one of the aspects of these families. In my novel, there are 5 chapters, which means 1 chapter per member of the family, talking and thinking about the elder brother who is dysfunctional. Each member of the family has her own personality. They have all experienced the same events, but at different ages, at different stages in their life, and that changes a great deal. Her mission, the mission of the youngest in the family, is, as she sees it, to rebel, because she's probably the one who suffered most from the situation.
Just realized something about Pascale, hearing Pascale Kramer talk about her book. There's something about a family that always brings you back. It always attracts you back to it, a sort of sucking in effect. And in a family, there are always very strong links between connections between brothers and sisters. And in my book, the family is also something which buoys you up and that you have to struggle with. And you have to struggle to gain your independence and some semblance of autonomy. But my characters are always only children. I have 3 younger sisters, and I get on with them very well. But I think that perhaps that structure, family structure, is too complex for me to portray intensely enough. And one person dealing with their parents is perhaps enough for me at this point in time.
True. I've read two of your books, the first and the last one, the third one, in other words, and you present women who are solitary, really alone.
De fuite et de solitude, enfin.
Yes, I really think that these two narrators, the one in Winter in Sokcho, who's not even named in the book, she's struggling with a transitional moment in Korean society. Traditionally, children, or at least the eldest child, and the women are expected to take care of parents until their death. And the social system is strongly based on that tradition. And the development of any state system for caring for the elderly is very slow. So, and it's seen as heresy to put somebody into a retirement home. She has gone to university. Her mother encouraged her to do this. Her mother is a fishmonger in a small provincial town, and at the same time, her mother knows that without her daughter, she'll have nothing left when she grows old, because the two of them live together. So this young woman dreams of leaving, but she's tragically connected to her mother, who loves her so. And it's something that it's as if their feet are sunk in the mud. At least that's the way it felt when I was writing the story. Now, the ending is much more open, so perhaps there's some hope that things will not always be that way.
Premier livre, La famille. Alors peut-être qu'on pourrait dire que dans
In their two first books, the family was vertical, whereas in Vladivostok Circus, you explore a group. But in the first two books, you were talking about bonds between generations and that which is transmitted from one generation to the other, all the more so when there has been exile, displacement, language problems within the family. Now, of course, the family, whether it's absent or present, is something which is part and parcel of our lives. We all experience family. And in preparing this meeting, I thought, of course, of what Tolstoy said, was that all unhappy families are different from one another, whereas all happy families can be similar in their own way. I remember something you wrote in your book, Une Famille. You say that Romain always weighed down on his family, and I wondered whether it was possible to envisage families from another point of view, to consider that a family can be something which is encouraging, can be a positive element. Would that be interesting in literature, to try and dig that aspect of a family as authors? Would you be attracted by that approach? One day I was at a round table with an author who said that she always tried to write serious novels, but in spite of herself, she was drawn to that which was light and happy. But I think it would be very interesting to write a novel on the way in which a family can encourage you. But even if you start that way in a family, that's not the way things end up being. I knew, in fact, from the beginning that Romain would be a member of the family who would weigh down on his family because of his addiction. Now, because Romain weighs down on his family, one has to consider and note that each member of the family tries to protect other members of the family. Of course, they all only see part of Romain's life. They don't exchange a lot about Romain's family, about Romain's life, but in fact, they have tried to help one another faced with this difficult situation. For example, the eldest daughter has become what she is, very good at school, girl who marries and very quickly has children, does what is expected of her in order to console her parents from what they have experienced with their eldest son. So there is interaction, and that is why it's interesting from a literary point of view. You can't not have interaction with other members of the family. A family is what shapes you, what forms you.
I think I have to challenge this sentence about happy families and unhappy families. I don't think you can rank happiness or unhappiness. It's really connected to each person's personal experience and proportionate to what people have experienced. Even in the most harmonious or seemingly harmonious family in the world, each individual member has his or her own traumatic experiences. And this is what makes it so interesting to explore these themes and these characters. Anybody can become an incredible character simply through their way of thinking, which will be very different to another person's way of thinking. And when they meet, there will be friction at some point. I think that looking at an experience, a common experience from different points of view is a very rich experience. Vladivostok Circus is a book that I experienced pure joy in writing. The first two books were carried by something more serious, heavier. And I wanted to write a story about good relationships, beautiful relationships. I wasn't sure if these were relationships of friendship, family, love. Maybe it's all of that rolled into one. These circus performers and this costume seamstress. Their ties with their own families are close and yet very distended. Some of them write, some of them are planning to meet for Christmas. And in their little confined space, a circus between two performing seasons, everybody is trying to do kind things for the others. And sometimes it's very awkward. They don't know what would actually please the other, but they're doing their best. I know the text can seem harsh in the way that the characters interact, but for me, this story is full of beauty.
Yes, I think this artist is carried by the two men in her team. They're the ones who are there to catch her so that she doesn't fall from the pole, if I've understood the act. And this is really something you never encounter in families, or it's just a way of beautifully expressing the idea that a family can be something that carries you. I'm very happy you have talked about the subjective aspect of families. There are weaknesses in families. One can decide to like an artist who has helped you, or choose certain friends that represent a weakness, and that sometimes is almost more important than what one encounters in one's family. And my question to you would be what you understand to be a family: blood ties or other sorts of ties and bonds? This is a structure, the family structure, that you could use to describe many different things. How would you answer? Well, it depends. I can answer as a writer or as a woman. In my private life, I have a family. In fact, I'm adopting two young adults just now, so I have a family that I have created myself. Members of my family have joined me. A family friend said, if you want to remain young, get yourself adopted by children. I believe in such bonds, but I never felt like exploring these bonds in a book. Why? Well, because the families we do not choose, the families we have born into, represent basically something that is quite dramatic, really. We have to accept our biological families far more than members of a family we choose for ourselves or that we build, because we generally choose people in the latter case, people we trust, we have an understanding with, we have affinities with. So in life, that interests me, but from a literary point of view, I don't know.
This is a really, really interesting question. I think about it a lot. I don't know if I've really worked on it that much, but personally, I grew up in two very different cultures, different in the way they see the family. My father's family is French. The family is scattered. We have close ties with some, not with others, and everybody thinks this is a normal configuration. But in Korea, very traditional configuration, family is sacred, and whatever happens, the family must meet, must get along. It's sort of a clan. And since I was a child, I've noticed that this can give rise to moments of great closeness and also some pretty high drama. And this has been a clear inspiration for me in my novels, at least for the first one, well, the second as well, for that matter. But, well, I have to give you my personal point of view because I can't really say, well, this is a theme, I'm working on this, but it's just a theme in literature. No, it's all connected to my personal life. So I think that if my characters are so solitary, I think that it's because I myself often wonder about the place one occupies in a group. What are the right interactions to have? I always feel really uncomfortable in a group. I never really know when I should speak, what I should say. It's really rare for me to feel fully part of a group. And I'm really fascinated when I see people in groups who have this confidence of belonging and of having the right to be there and have that sense of harmony in a group. And I think that writing is my way of exploring these issues, but from a safe perspective. The tension inherent in this is not a bad thing because it has enabled me to create texts which nurture me and which help me to find my place in society, have a status in society, and also get closer to people at all levels, because even if writing means that I have to be alone for months, that it's still a way of giving, whereas actual personal relationships are full of obstacles. That is a great word in praise of literature.
Well, I was just thinking that wanting to belong can push you to writing, wanting to belong, wanting to write, wanting to be more assured than one is in reality. I don't really have these problems any longer, but it is something I have known full well, and maybe this is something we share. Many artists, many writers have perhaps been on the margins of a group when they were young. And being able to write about it, I would say, is a very nice way of taking your revenge. It allows you to turn solitude into something that is creative. And in both of your cases, you can talk about it in surprising ways. Sometimes when you meet your readers, you can share your feelings, your experience. It's a gift you make to them. Yes, and we see, I think, that we're telling the story of other people. I was struck to see, in particular with the book The Living, Les Vivants, the accidental death of two young children. Very often people came up to me to tell me about dramatic situations of the same type they had experienced. And they probably revealed far more than they had ever revealed. Their talking about it was made possible because of my book. Then amongst my acquaintances, I discovered also lots of Romains in families I knew quite well. And with my publisher, we thought there is hardly a single family where there wasn't one member who went wrong at one point in time or who fell ill in one way or another. So people recognize themselves in our books. We create families with our public, in fact, and that's magnificent.
I was going to say the same thing, and it comes straight from the heart. Before I actually published, I never really hoped to publish because I thought that what I was writing was just my personal history, and it didn't really interest anyone else. But my first book got such good reactions, and perhaps for the second, my editor said, "Listen, trust me," and I'm really glad I did because I might not have been able to go any further if I hadn't published the second book, which I had a lot of trouble writing because of all these family tied up in knots. It was hard for me to separate the family parts from the novelistic aspects. But when I started to receive letters and feedback from readers and be able to talk to them directly in some cases, a lot of people said that they were very touched by the book because they felt like they'd been reading their own history, their own story, that they'd never been able to tell for themselves. That is the biggest compliment I think one can receive as an author. It gives incredible meaning to what you're doing. Because if I'm just writing for myself, maybe I wouldn't even write. Maybe I would just go out and walk in the forest, which I already do a lot. But maybe I would just do that without forcing myself to sit and write for so many hours all alone. I wouldn't say necessarily that I always feel like I'm starting from scratch when I start a new text. It takes a lot of time, it's laborious, and there are always a lot of doubts in my mind. But what I hang on to when I think maybe I should do something else is the people who've said, thank you for your work because it's given me a lot of strength. And there's a word that's very much in public view in fashion right now, which is community. Community, we have the community of the social media. Do you feel this with your readers when you meet them? Do you feel a sense of community?
I don't know about you. I don't meet that many readers of mine. But what is always very frustrating is that we are invited to meetings such as this one, where we are asked to talk about our work, about ourselves, and we're faced with people we don't know at all. We know nothing about them. What I like is when people then contact us or come up to us to tell me about their life. It's an interesting dialogue. If I write, it's because I like people. I'm interested to find out about their life, their experiences. I like that people come up to me and talk to me after a conversation such as the one we're having now, because it is less one-sided. as an event, and I have made friends in that way through exchanges of that type, but because there's a conversation afterwards.
I'd also say, in fact, I'd even go a bit further, that paradoxically it's an honor. And of course, it's always nice to talk about my work and hear their compliments, but I often feel very uncomfortable I feel like I've already given so much through the book, and I wonder what else I have to tell them that can be of any interest. But when I do have exchanges with readers on a more personal level, or even a less personal level, by letter, for example, by correspondence, I do tend to exchange letters or emails with people that I've never met. And some of these relationships have been going on for years, and they're very enriching for me. I find them very nourishing. I think that it's a way of extending the effect of the book, and it's also a very equal relationship. Flaubert said that one always writes for a friend who one doesn't know, an unknown friend, but in some cases it appears we can meet them. Thank you for connecting the readers with literature. I'd like to come back to your book, Les Billes du Pachinko, a book which I like very much, and a scene which I like very much, Elisa. Claire is playing Monopoly with her grandmother, and her grandmother keeps saying, listen, go to your room. I know that you're not interested in playing Monopoly. And Claire says, we weren't really playing. What we were doing was looking for a way to be together. And this being together seems very interesting to me. It's sometimes problematic within families. And in your books, we see that the characters are fighting to find this place where they can meet. And there are always little details that come and spoil the moment. And I think that both of you, each in your own way, you've mastered the best way of putting these details, highlighting these details. A gesture, a sound that a person makes, a word, a spoken word. And you're very gifted in identifying these details, highlighting them, and sometimes these very details explain the scene in a way that people can share it. In your writing process, how do you find these details? That's what I find fascinating in both your works. Is it a conscious phenomenon? Do you say to yourself, I don't want to write a banal, ordinary story, but I need a detail that will have some meaning?
Well, I think, for my part, that when one decides to describe an event, it's because something happens there. A tension, a revelation, something. The way in which that will be expressed is, for me, and perhaps for Elisa as well, but this is not the case for all authors. Some people think of language and words rather than pictures and images, but I see what I want to describe. It's visual. And I see exactly how each character lives the experience that is being described, and the words come. That's all I can say. Sometimes the words come, but they're not quite right. I try to use my ear to understand whether what I have said, what I've expressed is correct or not. Sometimes I realize that I've gone too far, I've been too heavy-handed, and I try to find something that is less spectacular, a less spectacular way of expressing events. And sometimes I come up with wording that is so little spectacular that only a very attentive reader will note the detail. I'm always afraid to overdo it, basically. And that is why I end up by just proceeding by light touches. In real life, I imagine, things often happen more dramatically. But in writing and literature, I don't think you can do it that way.
Listening to you, I just realized that this is perhaps something that is similar in our ways of writing, the need to be able to visualize. If I can't literally see the scene as if it were a painting or a visual sequence, I can't finish the scene. I mean, in ordinary life, I can have discussions about abstract things, but when I'm writing, I have to have a visual scene. In fact, sometimes I even do drawings, or I draw a map of the room. Sometimes I draw the characters, but without faces. That is something that I can't manage to see what their faces look like. But in terms of the significant element, I think that Pascale is right. This is the mysterious side of writing, and sometimes even the author can't explain it. But if there's something that I'm quite sure about, is that time is an important component in my work. And although my work's not autobiographical, everything that my characters go through has to be something that I have perceived with one of my senses, so that I can depict it as realistically as possible. And I'm the same as Pascale. I don't want to be too heavy-handed, and I tend to cut things out rather than add to these descriptions. But if I've had a big experience and I write about it, and then I think about it again afterwards, I realize that what remains is never what I thought would be important at the time it happened. It's usually a detail, a smell, and I don't know if that's to do with my own personal sensibility. And then I can re-inject things into this experience and let my characters have this experience. You said sensory, and you talked about the senses. And it's true that your writing is very sensory. Smell, taste, hearing are very present and very subtly dealt with. Pascale Kramer, in your work, I would say that it's more about emotionally sensory aspects. You are sensitive to the state of mind of characters, and you express these in the way a character is going to take off his shoes, for example, or her shoes. And in the very act of taking off her shoes, we can see that she's very weary. It's very subtle, a very subtle way of conveying emotions through a simple gesture. Are you like Elisa? Do you use the real experience and let it sit in you for a while and use the essence of it?
Well, you said you necessarily had to have experienced something to write about it, but how shall I put it? For me, I try to pretend I'm one of the characters in order to understand what it means to experience a dramatic situation they are experiencing. So I put myself in their shoes. To do that, I can only use my own emotions. Of course, we have in us all possible emotions: jealousy, intense love, hatred. We've experienced more or less everything there is to experience in the way of emotions. So using that makes it possible to understand what someone who is very different, someone who is older or younger than you are, who is of another gender, you can understand what their experience is. In one of the families, two of the families, I think, I had two different characters who were true believers. I am not, and there I had no internal reference to try and understand what it meant to believe. I think the mother, the character I describe, who is a mother, I was able to observe her from the outside, but trying to slip myself into her shoes and describe the situation in the family in the fourth chapters was very difficult for me. I finally managed, because I understood that it isn't because she had faith that she wasn't also rebelling against the situation she then faced. So it's in that way that I approached that part of the family struggle. But all the variations in feelings we can have is something we can observe in others. What you see in others is the way in which they're kicking off their shoes, which shows that they want to be comfortable or that they're weary. There are many small gestures which show you what they're experiencing. In fact, we can hear them say what they have to say, but that has already gone through a filter. But all the rest, the way in which they take the floor, the way in which they dress, that is how you get to know people, and that is what is really interesting. It's interesting to work on that when you're writing. Body language is a second or third approach in your books, Elisa, and I would like to bring up a theme which comes through strongly in both your works, is the impossibility there is to communicate. I think this is a very interesting topic in literature. How do you write about the impossibility to communicate? Of course, there are family secrets, all the things you hide and never express. That is probably the most obvious form of incommunicability in a family, and for Elisa, it's a matter of foreign languages, people who don't speak the same language and therefore can't understand one another. But I think there's also an impossibility to communicate, which has to do with exile, with culture. How can you write about that in words?
Well, that's the big question that obsesses me a bit less now, but I think it'll be with me all my life. It was a very strong preoccupation in my first two novels because I started to write to express everything I couldn't express in my other language, which is Korean. And I had an almost physical desire to fight French and say, it's because of French that I forgot my Korean. Of course, I could have learned Korean and become almost as fluent as I was in French, but I didn't do it. So all of this tension can be found in the characters who all speak a language but don't speak it with others or use another language to communicate with others. So communication is a lot more than just language. Cooking, drawing. And in my second novel, language has become almost a taboo. There's a historical weight connected to language. They don't even want to speak the language of the country they live in. I think that in more general terms, and perhaps this brings us back to what we were talking about with regard to groups, whether it's in life or in literature, I don't ever feel that I'm able to express what I really want to say. And after I've spoken to someone, and I think about it again, I think, oh, that I didn't express that correctly. I wasn't clear. And it's the same in my books. Every time I think, okay, now I'm really going to say what I think. And when it's over, I feel like it's a failure. And this is probably why I start over again from another angle each time. And so perhaps our relationship with our body, I mean, I'm not necessarily talking about dancers or actors, but our expression and what we capture through our five senses is something I latch onto because I don't think it lies. a sensation exists. It just exists, and a word can be is open to many different interpretations. And sometimes I think that if I could express myself without language, it would be much more faithful to what I think. And that's a bit paradoxical since I use words to express myself in my work. But a constant theme in my work is the difficulty in communication or not using language as the first vector of communication between characters.
Yes, I wanted to say something about the impossibility to communicate. I was often told that I am not interested in dialogues. It's not that I don't like them, but I don't show great interest, and I'm going down the dialogue route increasingly just so I'm not told my characters don't speak to one another. But if there is a painful situation, it's very difficult to express, isn't it? That you cannot share in certain cases. It's a fact. It doesn't have to do with the personality of my characters. It's just a given. As we were saying a while ago, words aren't what we can use best to say things to other people. I find my characters communicate, but in many different ways than through language, without, however, being able to share certain things. Massive joy or deep pain are not things you can share. Being next to someone who's madly in love, I know what that means. But how to share it? It's impossible to share. And that applies to many other things. I think our human nature is such that we can't communicate all that much. Yes, there's a very moving moment in a family where Olivier, the father, tries to kiss his daughter. He hasn't seen her for 6 months. She's just coming from abroad. She's changed quite a lot, and he's a bit awkward. He doesn't quite know whether he should take her in his arms, kiss her on her forehead. And in Les Billes du Pachinko, at one stage, Claire kisses the little girl she gives lessons to and suddenly realizes that in Japan, people don't kiss in that way. And I've just realized that you had both described situations of that type. Are those the moments where you try to use words in order to express what people are doing with their bodies? Well, in the beginning, the whole book was to be written from the point of view of the father, who is very much like a man I met, patron who created a Carmelite convent. He has a disease. He's very shy, but he wields a lot of power. And I had really liked that strange mixture. So the character of the father in my book, The Family, is a man who feels a great deal of tenderness, who is loving, who's very different from the sort of fathers you meet today who take care of their children, who have washed them, changed their diapers, etc. Additional to that, he is a man who had an important job, who probably came home late. So he is shy with his children. And I liked the idea of an physically impressive man who nevertheless is shy. He also has a very strong bond with his youngest daughter, Mathilde, but he is always slightly awkward towards her, with her. It was the first time I described a given situation from different points of view. When Mathilde comes back home, You see the father experience her return, and then you see Mathilde experiencing her own return back home. She feels awkward too because her father has just retired. She is now faced with a father who goes about the house doing everyday things. It's almost a bit embarrassing for her to see him shuffling about in his slippers at home. She doesn't quite know how to react. There's an awkwardness there which gives, I think, a scene which is filled with tenderness.
That makes me think that in Vladivostok Circus, my latest novel, this young woman goes to work for a trio of acrobats in a circus in Vladivostok. But my my original plan was to write a novel about a daughter and her father. And I couldn't do it. In my first novel, the father was dead. In the second, the father is far away. And in the latest novel, she writes to her father, and we have bits of the letter throughout the book. I think it was an attempt to show that there can be great love and yet great awkwardness, not knowing how to be with each other. In this book, the girl's mother died, and the father is an astrophysicist and always did his best to raise her with nannies, but didn't really know how best to relate to her. So this is something I was interested in exploring also, the father-daughter relationship and the distance between them. We've been talking about horizontal family seen from a horizontal and vertical perspective. Isn't your structure, your novel structure, a way of showing that children often reveal the weaknesses of their parents and in that way educate them and show them that they do have contradictions but also great potential? Is the family interesting for literature in that respect?
Yes, because children know their parents full well, and they know what parents hide behind the facade they show to the world. As a child, and as you grow up, you see that the education you're given by your parents doesn't quite reflect what your parents are. It's extremely interesting to look at all those different interactions, and within a couple as well, and between brothers and sisters. I discovered that with my last book. I don't have any brothers, but I have loved creating characters who are brothers to sisters in my books. And listening to you just a while ago, I was 20 when my father died. He'd been ill for a long time before dying. I don't, in other words, have any father figure who is a father for me. He was 50 when he died, by the way. Maybe the father in a family, Olivier, is the father I would have liked to have. I think we are perhaps slowly going to close this conversation, but I did want to ask you one other thing. Your books, are your books something that continue to live with you, or you live with them as though they were a member of your family? Well, yes, but as members of a family you don't see every day. You rediscover some members of your family. Sometimes you don't talk about a book for a long time, you don't think about it, then translation is made of the book, and you meet the work again. And there are echoes of a situation, of a character from one book to the other. I know that I am going to use a character in one of my previous books, but who has grown older in the meantime. I'm the only one who probably sees that, but I know there are recurrent characters, not all of them, but many of them. And there are physical traits as well, character traits that are repeated. Mothers, I always have a difficulty imagining a mother. Physically, very often they look alike. I see who my reference is as a mother, as an adult woman.
Well, it's funny because when I'm writing and getting close to the end of a book, I feel that I'm living with the characters. I'm the only one who knows them. Sometimes I find myself telling somebody else, talking to them or telling somebody else about what so-and-so is doing, and then realizing that I'm talking about a character who doesn't exist. And it's wild. I can really be completely inhabited by this interior world, this internal world. Les billes de Pachinko, we've talked a lot about because there have been many translations, so it's still very close to me. But as time goes by, the more it goes, the more I feel like I'm talking about old friends who I've lost contact with, and sometimes I even feel that I've almost forgotten them. But when a new translation comes out, it all comes back. But it does become a bit foggy, a bit blurry.
Les connaît au-delà du livre. Enfin, en tout cas, moi, je sais.
Yes, and we know them other than just in the book. I know how Olivier, the father, was when he was young. When I create a character, I create them from youth onto mature years, which the reader doesn't necessarily see. I have seen two of my books lead to a project on the screen, and when I was told how my characters would be represented on stage or on film, I realized that wasn't at all what I had in mind.
Well, there I think there's a big difference between the two of us. I cannot imagine the lives that my characters lead. Sometimes I even have to force myself to add biographical elements into my novels, but paradoxically, my characters are much more important than the general context. Maybe less so for the last novel because I spent less time building the characters, but for the first two novels, I wasn't really thinking of anyone, a physical person who I actually knew. But even today, I have no physical representation of these characters. They are sort of mixtures of people who I know, or archetypes like you said about your mother figure. At the same time, I don't really care what happened to them before or after the novel, the action in the novel. But it's a bit of a handicap because their past will obviously have an influence on what they do in the book. So I have to force myself to imagine their previous lives, but it doesn't interest me really. And it's true that your characters often live in the present moment, but don't really talk about themselves or their lives, and it's really the sensations and the present moment that take over. Earlier, you were talking about your relationship to the Korean language and the Korean part of yourself. I don't know about the other books, but I know that Winter in Sokcho was translated into Korean. What kind of contacts did you have with your Korean readers? What was it like to see the translation? What was it like to project the book into the other part of yourself and your family history? Well, I'm very lucky. The latest book is being translated, so the three will have been translated. And the reception of the three books was very different because the work of the translator influenced the language. He remained very close to the French structure of the book, and Korean is a very different language. In Korean, we avoid the word I insofar as possible, and in French, we like to use the word I. In my first novel, the narrator is a girl who doesn't really have a name or a body. She's a voice looking for an existence. She's very sketchy. And in Korean, the translator used the word I often, and it really reinforced her psychologically. So my Korean readers saw this narrator as being really assertive, in fact, a bit bolshy because of the use of the word I. In cultural terms, it's very interesting because in the second novel that talks about the Korean diaspora in Japan, which is a bit taboo, I got a lot of questions about the intercultural aspects, much more so than in the West, where other questions were important to people. I think that there's very strong, we're still seeing a lot of very strong influence of this. When I go to Korea, I'm really seen as the French girl. It's interesting to wonder why people in Korea ask certain questions. I grew up with Korean culture. Even though I'm considered as a foreigner there, I understand the culture quite well, and I think it's great. In addition to reading your book in Korean, which is your language, but at the same time not your language, it must be a funny feeling. Pascale, let me give you the final word. Your career spans over 20 years, and the themes stand out quite clearly in your work, and the theme of the family. What is the lesson you have learned through your writing about family ties? Were you able to let go, abandon, gain something? Give us a retrospective perspective.
I have a very small family, and I don't live with my family, so all this is quite far away. But I've learned a great deal about the way in which families live, and the latest one is a family with the greatest number of members that I have experienced. And with my latest book, I understood something which was very interesting, in particular compared to what my sister has experienced. Of course, when you have brothers and sisters, you realize you haven't quite lived through something, the same experience in the same way. When my father died, I saw my sister there, but in fact she wasn't there, and she deeply regretted not being there. But I built my memory of my father's death with her present. With my latest book, I understood the point to which the important thing on how you experience an event is the age at which you experience that event. That was a discovery for me. And then you must remember that not everybody experiences something at the same age. When Mathilde comes back home, much depends on where she's coming from. She has just traveled overnight in a bus from Spain. She's just understanding that the older son has given into his addiction again. But everybody understands that moment in a different way. So I was able to re-experience certain things. And it is through brothers and sisters and the way in which they work that I understood this type of situation. Thank you very much. Pascale Kramer, Une Famille, Édition Flammarion is your last book, and Elisa, Vladivostok Circus, Édition Zoe is your latest book. Thank you. Thank you to our audience. Thank you for following us. We will follow the third edition of BIBLIOTOPIA throughout the weekend. Thank you. Thank you.